Hi, welcome back to my garden. In a past video, once upon a time, I mentioned an idea that I came across in that wonderful little book, Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Barr. The idea was that we are all doers, learners and teachers. The stuff we make, I suppose, for example. But this week it struck me that there's perhaps an interesting parallel to that. If we look at not what we make, but how we use it or consume it. And it seems to me that there are sort of at least 3 levels of consumption. And that's what I wanted to speak about today. I mean, consumerism has become a bit of a dirty word. Well, a dirty word certainly in the circles in which I move, virtual circles, to be honest. But actually, even in this little village in the northeast of Brazil, people highlight the problems of rampant consumerism. But we must consume stuff. I mean, we consume food, and we have to. We need to. It gives us energy. We consume energy. The meaningful things that we do require very often vast amounts of energy. And we consume things for entertainment. So when people talk about consumerism as a bad thing, they're looking at it in a very specific way, as a sort of capitalist model, where we're in the cycle of making stuff solely to be consumed, and that our purpose for living becomes being machines of consumption. And it struck me this week when I was thinking about this that we definitely consume things on different levels. I mean, on one level, we consume for the sake of consuming, which might be out of necessity, or it might be because it is simply what we do. It gives us some kind of, I suppose, short-term gratification. We take this consumption, though, onto another level, and I'm going to look at something like, for example, music. We might consume music just because it gives us momentary distraction from our life problems. We might consume music because it is a means to an end. Where I live, people, even those that I would describe as not really having very much interest in music per se, would say that they like music, but what they really like is dancing. So music is fuel for dancing. But if I think about my own relationship to the consumption of music, at a certain point, I guess I went from being simply a consumer, becoming, to a certain degree, a collector of music. Music became sort of tied in to my identity, and it became a shared rallying point for like-minded people, for our tribe. It became a focal point for a community. And in that regard, I suppose I started, I must have bought my first records in my early teens. But as I grew older, I started to kind of structure my consumption of music. Let's put it that way. I listened to radio like so many other people, and I'd hear bands that I liked, and then I would seek out and collect their music. If their records were available, I would buy them. I would make a point of buying them. And as I sort of moved on in life, physically, geographically, actually, when I moved to England, I suppose I had a little bit more purchasing power at a certain point there, but I also started buying music magazines. So I was kind of consuming the music and then collecting it. So I was curating my consumption. It started to have a deeper meaning, and I started to have a more organized sort of connection to it, more knowledgeable. And I think, I would still have said I was a consumer of music. I certainly wasn't a producer of music, nor have I ever been. But I would put that differently to someone who would say, I like this song and not that song, would have the radio playing in the background, would go to a party and get up and dance when they heard the music that pushed all the right buttons. The collector of music is doing it on another level, so to speak. And beyond that level, there is, I think, another layer really of relating to music or other things. And I would call that the connoisseur. And even when at the very beginning, before my sort of music magazine poring over, obsessing over the minutiae of the bands that I liked and theorizing about it and perhaps beginning to understand it on a deeper level. Even before I dug into it in that sort of way, I do recall as a kid reading the record sleeves and finding it fascinating and starting to build up a deeper level understanding of the music. And I think that is an element of what being a connoisseur is. You become knowledgeable and you become discerning. You categorize things between the interesting, experimental and the less creative and banal, between the poorly executed and the brilliant. You dig into it and it becomes a sort of rich, fertile ground for research. And I think we can relate to almost anything that we do consume in that sort of way. You might watch television as an obsessive collector of the series. You always watch the program, you watch all of them without fail. Or you might become a connoisseur of the TV program, where you begin to dig into what it really means, or how it was made, or why they chose to do what they did. Obviously, you mention the word connoisseur, one might immediately think of something like whiskey or wine, where you could consume it just for, whether it's for pleasure or effect. You could collect it, or you could indeed become a connoisseur. And we cannot be connoisseurs of everything, simply because it requires making choices and commitments of time above and beyond the call of duty, so to speak. And certainly, given how much we will consume, even the most minimalist of people out there, we cannot consume all of it with the mindset of the connoisseur. Some of it we will just consume because it fulfills a simple purpose. It meets a need, whether it's the need to be sometimes distracted or to relax, or the need to refuel, or the need to soothe a troubled brow. Or we might collect stuff because we're becoming drawn to that thing. I think most connoisseurs at some point become collectors, probably before or at the beginning of that process, fairly early on. They start, it's sort of a process that feeds off of itself. And I think it's necessary to be a connoisseur of something. And I believe that it's necessary today for all of us to actively pursue that. Because whereas once upon a time, and I don't believe that we're living in evil times and there was this these halcyon days of yore, this golden age, sometime in the first half-ish of the last century, where everything was plentiful, but things had value, and we were more responsible and more engaged and less frivolous, and we weren't just mere consumers. Certainly, if we think of consumerism as a socio-economic philosophy, a lot of videos will point to how it really was a pursued strategy, I guess around about the 1950s, brought about for economic motivation to create a growth cycle within the economy, sort of post the Second World War austerity, and in a new golden age of economic plentifulness. And as much as I said, I don't want to suggest that there were these earlier golden ages, it is clear that round about that time we were at a point where productivity was increasing enormously through technological growth, through the power of fossil fuel energy, electrical energy, and so forth. And if we could produce all this stuff, well, there was no point just producing it, it needed to be consumed. There would have been a different model, a different path that we could have taken, which would have been to make everyone much more educated, to make that the focus, and to make people pay for the pleasure of collecting and consuming things of ever increasing quality and value, and to consume them in ways of greater depth and subtlety. But that wouldn't have been scalable. So there we are. I've got my little criticism in round the back door. But it doesn't change the fact that we do all consume stuff. But let's be a little bit more aware of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and how we might do it differently. So that's it for this week. I decided to make the video quickly rather than think about it. Rather like last week's video, it's been very much a spontaneous, off-the-cuff sort of process, a bit more of a wandering aloud in the gallery, except this time it's standing in my garden. So let me know what you think. Trust you're all well and your lives are filled with joy. And until next week, from a sunny Brazil, ciao.